So, thank you for joining us again here as we are examining the book of Ruth. This is our Wednesday night Bible study, going verse by verse through the book of Ruth. We have looked at Ruth chapter 1, and now we're going to look at Ruth chapter 2. We have seen in Ruth chapter 1 that there was a family from Israel, from Bethlehem, where the husband's name was Elimelech, the wife was Naomi. They had two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. There was a great famine in Israel, so they left Israel and went to Moab, a nearby nation just across the Jordan River, handful of miles away, couple handfuls of miles away. And they settled there where the famine was not as severe, or maybe even not at all. And during that period of time, they were there for 10 years. Elimelech was killed, died, I should say. Possibly the Lord killed him. But then Mahlon and Chilion married Moabite women. And then Mahlon and Chilion died. And Naomi now was left without a husband, without sons. She had no way to gain income. And she was left there alone, or at least she thought so. And her daughters-in-law tied themselves to her, but then she convinced one of them, Orpah, to remain behind in Moab, but Ruth would not stay. She went with Naomi, and they left together, and they went back to Bethlehem because the famine had passed. And they got back to Bethlehem, and Naomi, she was really struggling. She had lost her husband. She lost both sons. They had left Bethlehem to go find supply and find sustenance, only to find death waiting for them. And so when she finally returns, she tells everyone, "Stop calling me Naomi and call me Mara," which means bitter. That I'm bitter with grief. I'm bitter because of death. I'm bitter because of life's circumstances. And at that point, she even blames God for her circumstances. So that's where her faith was at this point, returned from Moab, struggling in her faith. We see Ruth at the end of Ruth chapter 1 is a new believer in spite of Naomi's struggle and Naomi's bitterness and Naomi's even lack of faith. But we see, as we're going to see throughout this book, Naomi, this is really a journey of her faith, of her faith struggle and then her return to faith, all while Ruth is persevering and her faith is only ever growing. And so we enter Ruth chapter 2 with Ruth and Naomi having returned to Bethlehem, no way to make money. They are extremely poor, and they need some way to gain food. And so Ruth chapter 2 verse 1 says, "Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." Now, this is a brief introduction to another key player in the book of Ruth, as well as we get some added context here for what is going to be taking place over the course of the rest of the book. So it appears from this verse that Boaz is a relative of Elimelech, but not of Naomi by blood, at least. But in ancient times, when a woman married a man, she was grafted, so to speak, into his family as a new part of it. So even though Naomi and Boaz did not appear to be blood related, they were considered to be related because of her familial status. Boaz is also called here in this verse. Very important phrase we're going to need for the next chapter. Boaz is called a worthy man. That word worthy there means that he was valiant and honorable. He was a great man among regular men. He was a mighty man of valor. It's the same way Gideon is described in Judges chapter 6, verse 12. Boaz here, he is a cut above the rest. And we also learn from Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, that Boaz was the son of Rahab from Jericho, which is a very interesting point of fact. He's the son of Rahab from Jericho. So when the Israelites under Joshua came into the promised land, attacked Jericho, Rahab was in Jericho, and she had protected the Israelite spies there in Jericho. And they said, if you keep this scarlet cord hung out of your window, then your people, everyone in your house, will be saved when we attack the city. And they protected her. Well, then Rahab marries an Israelite, and their son is Boaz here. So now look at verse 2. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So Ruth, a new believer, it would seem from this verse that Ruth has been studying scripture, because Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 to 10, and Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 through 22, both instruct a landowner not to harvest their entire field. Rather, harvesters were supposed to leave certain portions of the field, and any parts that were missed during the initial harvest also had to be left behind. So these crops were supposed to be left for the poor people and for the foreigners who were living among them, and Ruth is both of those. So these stipulations were included among the instructions of the law, because God wanted to make sure that provision was made and that no one was left behind. So Ruth is anticipating the Lord going before her and allowing one of the landowners to still be faithful to the way of the Lord. Now remember, this took place during the period of the Judges, when most of the people were either ignoring the ways of God or they were grossly distorting the ways of God. And in her newfound faith, it would seem that Ruth was seeking to adhere to the ways of God, and she was hoping to come across someone else who was also doing the same. And notice also Naomi's response here. The last chapter ended with Naomi consumed with self-focused bitterness of grief, and now it is possible that here she is merely apathetic because of her grief, but she has thus far not been very encouraging of Ruth's faithfulness. And honestly, it really seems to me that Naomi, as we see through the rest of the book, beginning here, she's turning a corner in her own faith. And as we are going to come to see in just a little bit, she does not appear to be as stricken with bitterness as she had been. Her faith seems to be strengthening again. Look at verse 3. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now, this reads as though it were by mere coincidence that Ruth happened to come to part of the field belonging to Boaz, but nothing is coincidental. The Lord is working. Ruth had been hopeful that she might find favor in the eyes of anyone who might own one of the fields around the town. And then here she was in the field of a man in whose eyes she would indeed find favor. Now, the way this worked, around towns, all the fields were laid out for the crops, and they were usually subdivided down into specific landowners by a small boundary of rocks, like boundary markers would divide the entire area around the city up into fields. So this guy owned this field, and then you get a line of little rocks, and then the next guy would own the next field. And so she just happens to come across the field where Boaz was. Now, there's no happenstance here. God intended this because Boaz was, as Ruth 2 verse 1 says, he was a great man of honor and valor. So it's not mere happenstance that Ruth finds herself in that field that day. Now think about it, there's no telling what kind of situations she encountered as she walked from the town to the fields to come to his specific field. The people she may have run into to delay her, to redirect her as she's making her way out of town to get out there so that she comes to the place where Boaz's field is situated. But God wanted to make sure that she made it to Boaz's field. And so however it plays out, the Lord brought her to Boaz's team of harvesters because he had a very important plan to fulfill. Look at verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." This could have been a very faithful greeting coming from Boaz, who was a faithful man, or it may have been a typical greeting of the day, devoid of any specific divine meaning. Now, I tend to believe that since we've already been told of the character of Boaz previously, that this greeting, while it may have just been a cultural greeting from the mouth of Boaz, it probably carried great faithful intentions. Look at verse 5. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" He noticed her right off the bat. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." So Boaz, he takes immediate notice of Ruth, wanting to find out everything he can about who exactly she is. In such a small community, it would serve to reason that Boaz had heard of Naomi's return after a decade in Moab. And if Boaz would have heard of Naomi's return, he undoubtedly would have also heard that Ruth came with her. And now he was seeing the person that he had only heard about through the grapevine. And the reaper foreman here then gives us, the readers, a little more insight into what Ruth had been doing that morning. She had approached and asked to be able to gather the leftovers from the field as the scripture said she could. And obviously she had studied and knew that she had the right to do this. So apparently the workers were also faithful to scripture because they let her do this. Or maybe they were faithful because their boss had instructed them to be so. And so the foreman, he adds a little bit to his explanation about Ruth's character. He describes her as a hard worker, someone who perseveres and is not afraid of the heat. She works all day. She had a short rest, but she worked all day. The implication reads to me almost as though she's working as hard, if not harder, than the other workers out in the field themselves. Look at verse 8. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then Boaz approaches Ruth here in the passage, and he gives her assurance of safety and provision as long as she remains in the field. And notice also he calls her my daughter. Now, there could be a couple of different reasons for this. It could just be because she's a young woman, and that's a general phrase typically used for young women. Or as many scholars believe, it's because Boaz is older than Ruth, possibly a good bit older than Ruth, maybe even of the next generation older. We don't really know. The scripture doesn't specify. He just calls her my daughter in his interactions with her. And he tells her to stay with his men, his workers, with the young women, protected by his workers. You know, because sometimes in the field, they weren't always very secure. But Boaz knew his guys would take care of her. And she would gather out there, you know. There were times in the gathering, the male workers would cut the sheaves and the female workers would come behind and tie up the sheaves into bundles. But there are also other times that men and women both cut and bound the sheaves together into bundles. We don't know how Boaz worked his field. We don't really know, but both those different strategies were employed in ancient times. And so he tells her that she doesn't have to lag behind his workers to gather up, but that she can come up to where the female field hands are working and she can gather there. And so by staying close to his workers, Boaz is extending the protection of his workers to her as well. He also offers to allow her to drink from the provisions of his workers, which is also very significant because typically in ancient times, the women would draw the water and the men would drink. And now he's saying that she can drink from the water his men have drawn. He doesn't want her to have to return to town or carry her own drink for refreshment. Otherwise, that would mean less time for her to harvest and less that she would have to be able to, or less that she would have to carry because she didn't have to carry any water if she just drinks what they've already got out there for the workers. Verse 10. Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Now, notice her words here. Yeah, back up in verse 2, she had hoped to find favor in the sight of someone. And here she acknowledges that. She's expressing the fulfillment of her prayerful hope. She's acknowledging the fulfillment of her words, as we all should. When our prayers are answered, we should immediately acknowledge with great gratitude the Lord's answer. And Ruth is displaying that great humility that she has in the face of a complete stranger and the reality of a fearfully racist culture against her, a Moabite, the Moabites being sworn enemies of the Israelites. Look at verse 11. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been faithfully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz reveals that he has heard all about what Ruth has been through and all that she has given up in order to remain with Naomi. And so he prays here. He prays for the Lord to take care of her as she has taken care of Naomi, as Ruth has taken care of Naomi. And then Boaz recognizes her faith. He comments on the fact that she has come to believe in the Lord and is trusting him for her life. So Ruth's statement to Naomi in the previous chapter in verses 16 and 17 about your people shall be my people, your God, my God, they're not mere lip service from Ruth to Naomi. She meant what she was saying. She abandoned the pagan faith of her ancestry and adopted the true faith of the Lord. Verse 13. Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." So Ruth again acknowledges the fulfillment of her prayerful hope of finding favor in someone's eyes. She says that Boaz has provided comfort, he's provided kindness and assurance of favor, even though he is under no seeming obligation to do so. And though we as the readers know from the description of his character in chapter 2, verse 1, that his faithfulness is undoubtedly leading him to treat Ruth with such compassion. He's a faithful person, and he's living that faith out in how he interacts, even with this Moabite. Verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread, and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain. And she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. So in addition to providing safety and something to drink throughout the day, Boaz also made sure that she had some dinner. He did not want her to go hungry or have to go back to town to get some dinner. So he invited her to come and eat with him and his workers from the food that he provided for his employees. It would seem that Boaz is not a stingy man. He passed her enough food until she was full, and he even had her take some leftovers. Having traveled with Naomi from Moab and having arrived in Bethlehem without any money or any way of receiving any food, it had probably been some time since Ruth had eaten until she was satisfied, until she was full. And so now she has received the Lord's kindness through another faithful person. She experiences a full stomach. But that was not going to be all. Verse 15. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not approach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So after dinner, Boaz tells his workers to invite Ruth to come up among the harvesters, so that rather than gathering from the remnants behind the workers, she can now gather the good grain from among the harvesters. Boaz even goes so far as to tell his workers to pull out some of the good stuff that they have already gathered and leave it for her to have. And he says it twice. He emphasizes that the workers are under no circumstances to say anything negative to her about where he is allowing her to gather sheaves. They're not to complain at all. Whereas the workers would normally have been working to gather extremely well all of the best grain in the best way for the owner of the field. But this day, Boaz wants them to provide Ruth with just as high a quality grain as they would typically gather just for him. Verse 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. So to beat out gleaned barley would be to separate the edible grain from the remainder of the stalk. Now, when it comes to what an ephah weighed, scholars disagree on this. It could have been equivalent to 5 full gallons of the grain heads, up to possibly 50 pounds, or a little bit less. We don't really know because of how ancient this time period was. But however you shake it out, it's a massive haul for one person for one day's worth of work. So it would seem that Boaz's workers had obeyed his instruction about gleaning good sheaves for Ruth to gather. The workers may have also had to provide Ruth with some sort of way to carry all of that barley and the leftover dinner back to Naomi's house. Now, try to imagine the amount of surprise on Naomi's face when Ruth comes up with all of that barley and the leftover dinner that she had from earlier. Verse 19. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I worked is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "This man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Naomi essentially says, "Where in the world did you get all of this?" She's overwhelmed by the amount with which Ruth arrives. And Naomi then speaks of Boaz and offers him a blessing and says that he has honored both Naomi and Ruth, as well as their dead family members, by providing so much for Naomi and Ruth. So he seems to have gone above and beyond what would have been typical behavior during this period of the Judges. Providing for 2 poor widowed relatives may not have been something that many people would have done, but Boaz would not let the opportunity pass without kindness. Then Naomi gives a little more insight. She says that Boaz is one of their redeemers, which is someone who accepts responsibility of caretaking property and people, including marrying the widow of a dead relative. So it would seem that Naomi has some matchmaking in mind as she immediately thinks of the provision for a kinsman redeemer. Now, also take special note of Naomi's words here. Her entire demeanor has changed. She has gone from bitterly claiming that God is actively working against her to here praising him for the kindness of his provision. Our perspective and our attention can make the world of difference in our spirit. Verse 21. And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So from the barley to the wheat harvest, it could have possibly been up to 2 months, which could signify quite a significant harvest considering the famine that they had just come from that began the book of Ruth. And so she's going to go out there with full intention to keep working throughout the barley harvest. And she's going to end up working on up to the wheat harvest as well. As we're going to see as we continue on next time, looking at Ruth chapter 3. So thank you for joining us here, and I hope to catch you back in the next chapter.